Pray on just a little while longer. Pray on just a little while longer. Pray on just a little while longer. And everything is gonna be alright. And the valley shout on just a little while longer. Shout on just a little while longer. Shout on just a little while longer. And everything is gonna be alright. Good evening. As was as our wonderful MC said, I'm Sharon Cooper-Murray, and I'm known as the Gullah Lady. When I was asked about standing before you and telling ghost stories, I thought, oh, that would be a wonderful thing to do. But I also thought a little bit about some stories that we call ghost stories that are actually true stories. So before I get into the story tonight, I'd like to make sure that all of us have the same definition of what we call ghosts. You see, in that netherworld, there aren't just ghosts, because ghosts are often those souls that are trapped. Some want to leave, but are afraid to leave. So they tend to wander about. Sometimes we'll see the outline of a figure. There have been people who said that they've had pieces of furniture to move slightly. But ghosts generally are not wicked. They're merely lost. But now we move on to what we call the hants. Now, hants are a lot different from what a ghost is. Because you see, a hant, their major purpose in life, or in death, according to how you look at it, theirs is to torture and torment. So they use our fears, and they attack us through those fears. And then you have what's known as the hags. Now, those of you that have ever heard the word succubus, then that's what a hag is. You see, hags are primarily designed to squeeze all of the breath out of you until you get to the brink of death, and then they go away. They continue to do that, and some people have said they've done it for their entire lives. But my thought is the spirit. Spirits, to me, are probably the most dangerous and the most wicked of all of these netherworld entities. And the story I'd like to share with you tonight is a true one, not just a ghost story. You see, I was born in rural Lake City, South Carolina. That's in Florence County, and what we call in South Carolina, the PD region. I was born and raised an only child with an extended family. So it was Daddy and Mommy and me. But then we had Papa. Papa was Daddy's father, and Earlene, who was my aunt, Daddy's sister. Well, Papa is what we call a healer. When someone got sick in our community, instead of going to the medical doctors, many of them came to Papa. People from not only our community, they came from all over the county to Papa. If someone started to act rather strangely, they bring them to Papa. Papa lived until my 6th year of life, and that summer, Papa passed away. Well, the next year is when it all began. You see, it began at first like a slight sound. It was more like a Now, the adults would tell us, children, you know that's just the wind, right? The wind is just blowing. And it didn't come that often, that first year. But Papa was gone, and we thought Papa always protected us all. But ever so often throughout the fall, when the times change and the night falls really early, we would hear that in what they call the pine woods. And you see, there are 2 types of pine wood in the PD. We have pine trees that grow rather thinly, but in the Camerontown community where I lived, there was one bunch of pine trees that if you stepped into them, they were so thick that in the middle of the day, you might think it's dust dark. So they told us children never, ever to walk into the thick pine woods alone. Well, of course, we didn't, because we thought there must be something bad in those pine woods for them to tell us that. But throughout that fall, ever so often, we'd hear well, soon they couldn't tell us that it was the wind, because it came even if the wind wasn't blowing. Then they started to tell us that it was an animal caught in a trap, and that was what they heard. Well, the first season goes by, and soon the sound disappears, and we all go back to our lives. Well, you see, in the area that I grew up in tobacco, cotton, and cornfields. The cornfields, the cotton fields, and the tobacco fields came almost up to your yard. My father, who was a farmer, just like our neighbors, Mr. Muck and Miss Missouri, Mr. Jim and Miss Curly, Billy and V's, TJ and Neefy, and all of their families, all of them were farmers. And they farmed in what I call today a collective. That meant when you are cropping tobacco, then one day it's going to be Daddy's Day, and everybody in the neighborhood comes and helps him to bring in his tobacco. And the following day, maybe it's Mr. Jim's day. And so on and so forth, until 5 days out of the week, the community was working together. Well, that second year, it came back. Now, we never talked about this once it went away, but it came back. And this time when it came back, it sounded more like well, of course, no one said that was the wind. But we all would sit in the house because it was some distance away. You could tell from the sound. Well, Daddy would say, "Oh, don't pay that no attention. There's some kind of probably old possum or coon." that they got caught out there in a trap and it's just loud, that's all. But all of us would sit in the house, Mommy, me, Daddy. By then, Earlene had gotten married and left. But then 2 of my cousins moved in. So it was Wesley and Albert. So when that sound, that came, we all looked at each other. But it still was some distance away. And the same story would banter about in the community. We children would get together and ask, did y'all hear that last night? And they'd say, yeah, but Daddy said nothing but the wind. Someone else said, no, my daddy said it was some kind of animals caught in a trap. But we children, we thought it was something else that they just didn't want to tell us. So by the 3rd year when it came quite differently that year. During that year when it came and it was far closer and it sounded more like but it was not near our houses. But during that 3rd year, it started to come closer and closer. And we'd hear, well, by now we are pretty much terrified. They're still telling us about the wind and they're still telling us about the animals. But we don't believe that at all by now. So one night, while we're all sitting in the house, and we lived in a big old wooden drafty house, and all of us, before we went to bed, sat in the sitting room. But the sitting room, of course, was very different from the living room. The sitting room was where everybody just sat around and the big heater was there that kept everyone warm. And we were sitting that night and it came. But when it came, it wasn't far away. It was very, very close. It sounded as if it was in the field, right outside of the house. So this time it comes and it says, well, everybody almost jumped out of their skin. So Daddy ran and got the rifle. Wesley got the shotgun. Albert got the pistol. And they said, y'all sit right here because we're going to find out what this is tonight. They went outside. Now, of course, my mother, before they left the house, was saying, no, y'all better not go out there. Y'all better not go out there because you mess around and ain't none of y'all going to come back. But Daddy said, oh, whoever out there, we going to find tonight. Well, they stayed gone for several hours, and they came back. Well, they didn't find it, or at least they said to us they didn't, but Daddy had a real wild-looking look in his eyes. So we thought they found something, but they didn't want to frighten us. So the next day, Mr. Jim, who lived up the road, Mr. Muck, who lived across the field, TJ, who lived down the road, and Billy, early that morning, came to the house. And all of them were standing in the yard. And they decided that day that they were going to go look for it. Well, by midday, the word that they are going to go find this thing, because it had been coming for too many years. Well, now someone mentioned that, you know, ever since Papa died, that thing started coming. So they believed, as I did, Papa protected us from that thing. So the next night, Papa, Daddy, Mr. Jim, Mr. Muck, TJ, Billy, and Mr. Sula came along. Now they decided the way to catch this thing, as they were going to walk that woods about 10 to 15 paces apart. So if anything came up, they'd be close enough to one another that they could get to the other one before it got them. So they wandered and walked and hunted for this thing all night until early in the morning. Well, then all the men came back to our house and then departed for theirs. But Mr. Sula didn't come back. So everyone thought he must have decided he was tired of walking around there in the woods with them and that he was just going to go on home. Well, by daybreak, Mr. Sula's wife, we all called her Miss Sweet. Miss Sweet came up to the house and she asked Daddy, "Where's Sula at?" And Daddy said, "Well, didn't he come home?" She said, "No, she hadn't seen him. That she'd stop by Mr. Jim's house. She'd stop by Mr. Muck. She'd asked Billy. She'd asked TJ. And no one saw Mr. Sula." So they all went to work that day plowing the fields because Daddy didn't have a tractor. We had 2 mules, Ida and Beck. So Daddy plowed all day, and that night the men decided they would go look for this thing, because by now everyone in our community is very upset because no one knows what this thing is. So again, they go out looking, and this night they're just trying to find Mr. Sula. Well, they looked the first night and looked and looked and looked, but no Sula. So they'd come home, and some people would say, "You know, Sula done run off. That's what he did. He run off. That's what happened." But everyone that knew Mr. Sula knew that he'd never do that. So the next night they go looking. By now, it is very near us all. When it was at our house, it was near Mr. Sula's house. It was near Mr. Muck's house. It was near TJ's house and Billy's. No one could understand how this one thing could be at so many houses at the same time, and most of us lived more than a quarter of a mile from each other. So they had to find what it was. So the third night they go out, and the thing now is in the woods close to them. As they walked around, one felt like it was very close to them because they heard, "Ah!" But when they turned, it was gone. The next one, only standing feet away, could have sworn it was by him. And the next person swore it was by them. Well, they wandered all night trying to find it. Until the wee hours of the morning, they didn't find it, but they did find Mr. Sula. Mr. Sula was an extremely tall man. For that time, you didn't find people as you find today that are almost 7 feet tall. But Mr. Sula was probably about 6'4" or 5", so he towered above all of the other men. They found him sitting by a tree, and he was nodding back and forth. So Daddy said they walked up to him and said, "Sula, where you been?" But he didn't speak. So finally they got him up and they took him home. For the next 10 days, Mr. Sula did not utter a sound. They'd have to lead him to the bed. They'd have to get him up. They'd have to feed him. They did everything because he simply sat and stared. And on the 10th day, he started talking again. All of us in the community, though none of us ever said it to one another, vowed never to speak of it again. And over the next 12 months, one by one, each family moved away. We were the last, because Daddy still continued to say that it was an animal of some kind out there. We were the last family to leave. The houses that all of us lived in, no one was ever able to live in those houses again. They were all, one by one, torn down. Now I say to you, you may not believe that ghosts and spirits and hants and hags exist. But that year, from 6 years old to 9, we lived with that spirit. So I know that spirits exist. Now they told us a few things that I'd like to share with you. A spirit can only come to you if you invite it in. So I caution you to be careful what you invite into your world, because sometimes what you're inviting is a spirit that you cannot control, because a spirit is a life-giving force. And if you invite them in, there is no controlling them. Now, you others, let's just say you're asleep one night and you start to feel this pressure on your chest, and you start trying to scream and not a sound will come out. I say to you that that's probably a hag in your house. Now what you can do for a hag, because I want to prepare all of you for when you leave here tonight, that if any of these spirits that we talk about are hants or hags, how you can make sure they don't follow you. So if a hag does that to you, you need to get one of those old-time brooms, you know, with all the straw, and lay it in front of your door. Because you see, a hag is easily distracted. So if you get one of those, instead of him coming after you, the hag is going to have to count every single straw in the room. Well, now if that doesn't work, I'm going to invite you to do this. Get a bowl, fill it with salt crystals, and put it by your window, and a bowl on either side of your bed. Because if by chance he's able to count every grain of salt in that bowl, he's got another bowl waiting for him at the bed. So that should possibly save you. Now the hant, which is mischievous, is very much like the hag. So find something that has a lot of pieces and put it by your beds and on your windowsills. Well, with a ghost, I'm really sorry. There's nothing I can tell you to help you with them. But keep in mind, ghosts generally don't bother you that much anyway. So that is the story that I experienced as a child. And tonight is the first time I've ever told anyone that story. I don't know anyone in our community that had ever repeated that. So I hope tonight that by telling you this story, that I have not unleashed